Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Lighthouse Illuminations webinar today. Today's topic is post-RFX, what to think about when migrating large volumes of data. My name is Chris Stevens. I'm a Senior Director in the Client Services Group at Lighthouse, and I will introduce you to the other panelists shortly. But first, just want to get started with a few housekeeping items. So a PDF copy of the deck will be provided after the presentation. It's at the top of the survey link, and the recording will also be made available later this week. Please submit any questions or comments that you may have throughout today's webinar in the chat at any time. We'd love to make it interactive with our experts, panelists, and try to make this as interactive as possible and as targeted as possible to what you all are interested in learning today. So now let's go ahead and get started with introductions. So Rebecca and Erica, can you go ahead and introduce yourselves?
Good morning, everybody. I'm Rebecca Sipowich, Vice President, Assistant General Counsel for Ocwen Financial Corporation, located down in Florida. I am generally a litigator, and among other hats that I wear, I have run our e-discovery relationship and recently an e-discovery RFP for Ocwen.
Hi, my name is Erica Namneth. I lead our U.S. Advisory Services team, and I've been in the industry for about 15 years now. My background is in linguistics, and when I first started out, I was building search queries in support of sample-based review. That kind of morphed into a little bit more of a traditional e-discovery work with project management and then operations. And then finally, in March of last year, I got to join the advisory services team here and expand into information governance and e-discovery consulting related to M365, as well as enterprise deployments of software like Nuix, Brainspace, and Relativity. And then, of course, I do like to help out with migrations too.
All right, great. Thank you both, and special thanks to Rebecca for joining us as the guest panelist today. Really appreciate her investing the time in this conversation. So let's move on to the agenda. So we're going to start with some initial considerations around migrations post-RFX. And just to clarify what RFX means in this context, request for proposal, request for bid, request for information. You've finished the RFP process. You've selected a vendor that you want to migrate your cases to, and that's what we're referencing when we say post-RFX. We're going to talk about some key benefits to data migrations, as well as some hidden benefits as well that we kind of unearth through the process. Crucial data points to track as you're working through a migration. There's a lot of moving pieces, a lot of activities running in parallel, a lot of different stakeholders and dependencies. So there's a lot of information to track and stay on top of. We're going to talk about preparing for the unexpected and what Erica and Rebecca have encountered in their experience as they've worked through these difficult migrations. And then we'll walk through some key takeaways and also do some Q&A at the end. So again, feel free to send your questions at any time as we're going through the session, and then we'll reserve some time at the end to try to address as many as we can. So first, we're going to start with a poll, just to get a sense of the experience level of the audience and what you all may be most interested in. So the first poll question is, if you can take a look at the polling section in the WebEx, is what is your experience with e-discovery migrations? Have you done a migration previously? Are you in the process of a migration, considering one? Have never gone through one, or have no idea what we're talking about when we're referring to a migration, which hopefully you'll have a better sense of at the end. So if you could just go in and submit your answers, we're going to go ahead and share the results shortly. And so it looks like we have 17% have gone through, 33% are actively in the process, 33 have never gone through a migration, and everyone knows what a migration is. So that's good. I'm glad that everyone at least has that baseline to work with for today's conversation. We're just going to do one more poll question, which is, what is your level of technical e-discovery experience? Do you have none? Are you a novice within, from an e-discovery tech standpoint, intermediate, or advanced? There are a lot of different topics around migrations, both from a strategic level, a pricing level, but from a technical perspective, they also can be incredibly complex. So we're going to touch on that a bit today on all those different areas, but just curious as to where the audience stands from a technical expertise perspective. So that poll ended, and we're waiting for the results. Just takes 1 second. So most of our audience today is a technical e-discovery superstar, which is awesome, or has some sort of basic or intermediate understanding. So sounds like we have a more technical audience out there, which will help, inform some of our talking points. So thank you all for investing the time in that. One final question. What aspects of a migration are you most interested in learning about today? 3 options, legal, strategic, or technical. Again, we're going to touch on all 3 topics, but if you could just click a choice and hit submit, we'd be curious to see where the audience stands. So we're kind of split down the middle between legal and strategic, and actually less interest in the technical side of it. So Erica, you might have to take off one of your technical hats for some of the presentations.
I'll just leave it all to Rebecca.
You'll have to focus on the legal and strategic side more, but there's some folks out there who want the technical, so we'll go there too. All right, great. All right, so let's move into the meat and potatoes of the presentation. We're going to start by talking about key stakeholders. So there are lots of different stakeholders involved in these data migrations. Rebecca, can you help me set the stage here in terms of who are the key stakeholders that need to be involved in a large migration like this?
So for a large migration, you really need to have legal, procurement, and project management involved really from the get-go internally, at least in my experience. Legal, because your internal and external counsel need to be able to understand what they can and cannot do with the data at your prior vendor and when they can touch it again at the new vendor. There also may be, as I think we're going to discuss later on, timing issues that you need to build into the migration itself based on the litigation schedule. Procurement, your contracting group, to make sure that everybody's on the same page as to how the process should go and what the requirements are under both your previous contract and your current contract with your current vendor. Project management, to keep everything organized and flowing correctly. If you have a PMO or a Six Sigma type of group, you should definitely rely on them to help usher through the process.
Yeah, so beyond the groups that Rebecca mentioned, I would also really emphasize that you definitely want to include outside counsel. I mean, I think they're the keepers of some of the most critical information with respect to planning around existing matters. So, they're going to be able to get into the details with respect to case deadlines, what stage they're at, the activity, and all of these things are things that you need to accommodate into your planning. So like, is there a discovery deadline just coming up like right next month? Like maybe it makes sense to put, make sure that you're not kicking things off until after that. Is a matter basically over and kind of just there for reference? Well, maybe it's easy to go ahead and tackle that first because it's not going to be too disruptive. If you have depositions in progress, that's tough, right? Because it's kind of a day by day, everything's happening on the fly as you get more information. And so you definitely want folks to have access to their different matters. So definitely include outside counsel for that.
Right.
And then on top of that, I would say, don't forget about your IT organization. So these are the folks that can advise on what does and doesn't need to be kept. So for example, in some cases, are there copies of collected data that are already sitting on site with your organization? And if so, does that mean the current vendor can dispose of their copies and not have to actually transfer that anywhere? This can mean fewer steps in your process and probably less cost. IT can also tell you about what your current infrastructure can handle. So like maybe in part of your migration strategy, you're considering moving some of the things back to your organization rather than to the new vendor. And maybe it's a pretty significant volume. You're definitely going to want to be discussing that with your IT folks to make sure that you have that you can actually accommodate that. And if not, plan on how to address that or what maybe different options might be.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. And legal also needs to interplay with that, or your compliance group. Depends on who owns your corporate document retention policy. Mm-hmm. In our recent migration, we had matters that had been closed for significant enough time that we wanted to bring that data back on site, but we still needed to retain it due to our document retention policies. So the interplay among these key stakeholders is also very important.
Yep, definitely.
Yeah, it's a really diverse group of stakeholders, and I think that can create challenges because there's also some stakeholders who don't have any experience or really understand e-discovery as well. Just curious, from your perspective, Rebecca, were there any groups that were more challenging to work with or resistant to the process?
Honestly, both project management and IT were a little challenging. They kept looking at this in our migration as a very straight technology contract, which if you've dealt with e-discovery at all, that it's not. There's a lot of various permutations and levels. Like we were just discussing, there may be some data that you want to bring back onto your corporate servers, some data that needs to come into your new vendor. With the data that we've been bringing over to Lighthouse, we've been going through also and culling out unnecessary repositories that can then, or we plan to, I should say, come back onto our own servers rather than take up the data storage in Lighthouse. And that's something that everybody needs to understand, and what the interplay is with your contract and your statement of work with the vendor, whether it's your data allowance with the vendor or project management hours with the vendor. And so IT and procurement really didn't fully grasp that aspect of the migration until we were well down the path of the migration, and we had to keep redirecting them.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, this isn't necessarily a group that's going to be challenging or resistant, but the current vendor that you're migrating away from, they're probably not excited about this situation because essentially they're losing business, right? So I think just keeping that in mind within the conversations, just to have that sensitivity, it helps make the conversations easier and everyone be just more open to collaboration and working together.
Definitely adds another wrinkle to an already complex process. So, okay, well, let's move on to something a little bit more technical in nature in terms of talking about migrating between various platforms. Erica, what are some of the key differences between migrating between different platforms? Let's say you're going from relativity to another platform or relativity to relativity. What are some of the considerations around this additional complexity?
Yeah, I mean, there are definitely a lot of benefits to switching, depending on your situation, as well as some things that can be challenging. But I mean, on the benefit side, I think a lot of times I see migrations that are happening simply because whatever the client is on currently is old and not really supported anymore, and so isn't up to date in terms of all the capabilities that a lot of us take for granted now with kind of mainstream platforms. So maybe you can't thread, or native redaction is an option, and these things are really important to you. Like that's going to definitely be a driver in looking to a new platform. And there's also maybe the situation with your current vendor just isn't great, and you are motivated enough that even moving to something different and learning something new is not a deterrent because, frankly, just the situation just isn't working. And then, there's also instances where you've been working with a proprietary tool for a long time, and maybe that's creating a bit of a training burden, like when you have new review teams and stuff, because it's not the mainstream, it's not just familiar to everyone, and you're looking to kind of streamline it and reduce that burden. So those can all be, you know, benefits to moving to something new, depending on what you're moving to. On the other hand, when you're switching platforms, you know, you no longer have the benefit that comes with going from the same thing to the same thing, and that you can just kind of grab the database from one place, move it to another one, and spin it back up. And obviously, I'm oversimplifying quite a bit, but at a very high level, that's pretty much what's happening when you're going from platform to the same platform. If it's different, you know, you're probably in a situation that requires exporting from one platform, so pulling out all the metadata, text, natives, everything, and then loading that into something else. And there are some consequences to that. So, you know, some of the main ones that aren't necessarily obvious on the surface is you can lose information this way. So a lot of times there are different artifacts that simply aren't amenable to this type of workload, where they're just not things that can be exported and imported. So I'm thinking about an audit history, which is usually sprawling, you know, especially if a matter has been around for a long time, that's recording everything that's ever happened in your database. You know, this isn't something that can just be downloaded and uploaded somewhere else, and you can't just grab it and move it over. And maybe that doesn't matter. Maybe you don't have any concerns about this. You don't need to have, know all your audit history, but maybe it's really important. And so you're definitely going to want to work with your vendor to figure out how to address that. And then there's just complexity around exporting and importing that doesn't come with, you know, having a one-to-one move. That there's a lot more moving pieces, meaning that there are more steps required. It can take a little bit longer. And then, of course, you know, as soon as there are more steps involved, that's more opportunity for error, right? So you need to make sure that you're kind of building in extra time for QC and course correction and such. And then this is a little less common, but sometimes there's just a mismatch in formats when you're switching between platforms. So maybe you can absolutely export out of one and import into another, but in between you have to do some sort of conversion to make the existing data consistent with what's needed for the new platform. So that can add, you know, additional time and potentially cost. But again, it really just goes down to weighing everything that's kind of in front of you and what's important to you and what isn't, to decide what the best course is. And that's really why it's so important to work with your vendor, or even multiple vendors, when you're trying to figure out what you want to do really early on in your planning, because they can walk you through all the pros and cons that are specific to your situation, right? Like we can talk about general stuff all day, but your situation is not going to be the same as everyone else's. And so they can take you through that, explain the options available to you, and then also just help advise on what the best path forward is.
Yeah, great points. And I think unearthing all those pros and cons really early on is critical, because otherwise the stakeholders are kind of going in blind when they're making a decision around, you know, when to migrate and who to migrate to.
Right.
But anytime you unearth like an additional con, say you're losing some critical piece of information through the migration process that you weren't anticipating, you know, that's obviously going to be problematic to the overall project goal. So, yeah, great points. Rebecca, do you have anything else to add on in terms of migration between various platforms and how you go about evaluating the pros and cons?
So I think here the legal team needs to understand what that all means and what various platforms there are. You know, your in-house counsel, generally, unless they're an e-discovery expert, may not know that they have matters that are on 3 different platforms. We did our migration. When we first started talking about this, we did not realize that we had Relativity, Rel1, and Nuix databases that all needed to transfer over. And that added, as Erica was explaining, that adds a big complexity to the entire project. And we had to work with our former vendor, Lighthouse, our external counsel, to figure out what actually needed to come over, whether we could keep them in the databases or in the platforms they were currently in, and what that meant for the go forward, what we would lose, what we would be able to save through the migration process. And that was definitely not something that the legal team had a good grasp on as we began the migration process. You know, we found that we had, before we were with Lighthouse, we were with a previous vendor. Before that, we let our outside counsel basically just choose whoever they wanted to do e-discovery. So we had so many different database platforms that we just didn't even know what to do with or how to utilize. And that added complexity, and it added confusion to the legal team itself. So that is, I think, something that needs to be educated among your in-house attorneys.
So I think that's a good segue to the next slide, and we kind of talked about it a little bit, which is consulting prior to migrating. So Rebecca, at what point do you need to start consulting with the vendor you are moving to?
I would start consulting potentially during the RFP process. You need to have a good grasp on what you have at your current vendor, how much data you have, what platforms it's living in, what the reality of your current repository is, to work on that as part of the RFP process, get things priced properly, and get everybody on the same page of what exactly the migration will entail. We did not have that kind of information or data, which led to some real complexities, especially at the early stages of our migration, led to some difficulties, and there were communication issues because of that, and increased costs and complexities because of that. So the earlier you can get all of that data and have your proposed vendor understand what your world looks like, the better.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. Earlier the better, and I don't think that can really be emphasized enough. In all honesty, I don't think there's even a too early. So as soon as you're thinking about this, you're definitely going to start talking to folks about what it might mean and figuring out all the details. So I think in terms of specifically what you need to be thinking about, and I mentioned this a little bit earlier in relation to the groups that should be involved, but timeline is big, and it comes into play in a lot of different ways. I mean, we talked about, case deadlines and such earlier, but then there's also like, is there a drop dead date for this to be done that we're trying to work towards? So for example, maybe that there's a subscription with the current vendor that ends at a particular point, and we're really trying to not have to extend that subscription. You need to keep that in mind in your planning, right? And then there's like the non-technical timing, like what are the expectations around response times in terms of working with different folks, and what are your turnarounds for getting information on different pieces of the process. You want to avoid basing your plan on bad assumptions by getting all of this, setting these expectations up front. Another thing that you want to be thinking about is in terms of everything that's going on, are there pieces of it that can happen in tandem, or are there pieces of it that have to be consecutive, like meaning that they can't overlap? So no one wants the process to take longer than it needs to, so you want to plan on overlap wherever you can. I mean, within reason, of course. You don't want to take on too much and then just end up with more than you can handle. But have a discussion with both vendors about what's reasonable. Like, can we be running 3 migrations at the same time, or does it need to be one at a time? When one is maybe one piece of your migration is being archived, can another be in the transfer process? Just understanding, what that means. And then on top of that, it's really I think you really need to take stock of what you have. And we've kind of talked about this a little bit throughout, but just basically you need to inventory whatever is in play. Don't forget about what's behind the scenes. I mean, Rebecca mentioned this earlier. There's a lot of stuff that you don't necessarily have direct insight into because you're not touching it. And this is often the case behind the review database. There's processing tools. Maybe there's a separate analytics tool where all your source data sits, all that kind of stuff. And maybe you might even have productions sitting outside the review platform that you need to account for as well. So all in all, you just definitely want to be pushing for backup planning and understanding how things fit in different situations. So, for example, it's good to have a fallback in case your migration runs into a problem. Make sure you cover the worst case scenario, which is that you need to start over. So, just basically make sure you always have a plan B. And all these things are super important, but not just at the early planning stage. Like, you need to be in constant communication with everyone involved to ensure alignment. Things can change, at any moment. There's all kinds of different contingencies, right? and you might need to adjust your plan. So just, prepare yourself for that and make sure you can be as proactive as possible. And if you're in a situation where folks are kind of working in a vacuum and not in communication, you probably won't be positioned well to be proactive, and that can hurt.
So we have a question for the panelists. What are the key things I should know about my data and vendor before I start the migration process? So, Rebecca, is that something you could address?
Yeah, I think that the key things that you need to know about your data are what is your data. You need to understand when your previous vendor is giving you data numbers, what that entails. Is that just the production data? Is that just a repository? Is it a combination of both? Are there repositories that don't actually need to transfer because they were just such a vast vacuum of information that things were just pulled from, and so they didn't really have to do with the case itself? It was just a full data set that you actually already have on site at the company. You need to understand the nitty-gritty details about the data and what you have and what you actually need. You also need to understand what your vendor is capable of, both current and new vendor, and how they're going to transfer the data in between. We have had some pretty big issues that were compounded by COVID, by the pandemic, on getting some of our data over because nobody was in the data center. Nobody was on site at our prior vendor in order to get the larger productions put onto hard drives and sent over. So you need to understand the capabilities of your vendors as well. And I'll shoot that off to Erica, but before I do, another thing with should you start consulting on the migration is early on, obviously after the RFP, during the RFX stage, but before your migrations really start, get your outside counsel involved. Set up calls between your migrating to vendor and your law firms who are handling these cases that are coming over, because they may have a better handle on what actually is in there and what the data is and what actually needs to transfer than your current vendor, and then more so even than your in-house counsel, because they're the ones with their hands in the data. And they're also going to be key on timeline issues. But, we've been looking at the data in some of our cases, knowing that we have data that's really not relevant, that's really not necessary, and where we can cut down on the data storage numbers as we migrate things over.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with all that. I think another thing that is important that isn't necessarily something that folks think of instinctively is really establishing the role and expectation of your vendors, meaning understanding what you can expect from your current vendor and what you can expect from your new one in the migration process. And I'm talking mostly about who is driving, like who's going to manage the overall process, who's going to lay out schedules and work with everybody to make sure that things are on track. You definitely want a specific party to be responsible for that, because otherwise it's easy to either have people stepping on each other or on the other side just missing some things because there isn't a single kind of point of responsibility.
Yeah, I'd say from an e-discovery services standpoint, migrations require more formal project management or fit into the profile of formal project management than most standard e-discovery projects. I think sometimes it's tough to take a standard e-discovery project and use project management framework to move it forward and put structure around it. But for migrations, I think it's completely different. I think a lot of the formal project management framework that PMO offices used, we have our PMO involved on data migrations here at Lighthouse. It's incredibly helpful to use those tools for reporting, to track activities, dependencies, all those things. And not that it's not useful in normal e-discovery projects, but I think it's really, really critical to these complex migrations.
I agree with that.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay, well, we talked about a lot of the complexities of migrating. So for those folks that may be on the line who are considering it, instead of scaring them away from the idea of migrating their data to a new vendor, what are the key benefits? Because there are a lot of benefits, right? We're doing this for a reason, whether it's a cost reason, whether it's a service-related reason. You know, like Erica was saying, maybe you're currently on a old technology that's not up to par with current standards or not industry standards. So let's talk through some of the key benefits. Rebecca, do you want to start and talk about some of the benefits you found through the process, or any hidden benefits you might have learned through the process as well?
Sure. So the first thing is a fresh perspective on your e-discovery processes. Just even back at the RFP stage, talking to various vendors and learning things that may have changed in the industry and the technology that may have changed that we weren't aware of. Moving into the migration process, getting an idea of what data we maybe never needed to keep with the vendor, what data we could, how to better bring data over, how to better store our data, how to better review our data, set up a better, we're in the process of setting up a better process for doing our internal searches with our IT department and bringing it over to Lighthouse. So all of those steps, there's so many. And when you're stuck with with a contract for several years and you just kind of go along your processes and you don't take that step backwards to re-look at how you're doing things and whether there's a better, more efficient way, this migration process gives you that opportunity to delve in, utilize, we've been looking at it with the Six Sigma team internally, utilize those fresh eyes and get a fresh perspective on maybe a better way for the company to do this process from step one all the way through to the production through your vendor. I've also found it's given us a better understanding of our outside counsel. These calls that we have, we scheduled a call between Lighthouse and our external counsel on every major matter that we were moving over. And through that, and through those calls, we were able to really understand who had a good grasp on the data, who had a good grasp on the e-discovery process, who was really willing to work with us on the migration, and whether there was any reticence from outside counsel on the migration process itself. And we had we had counsel who was extremely helpful in the process and giving us ideas on ways to cut back on data, to save costs, to make it more efficient, and being able to partner with our counsel in that way really helped the overall migration process. It's also helped our costs. And that's really important, partnering with your external counsel to make sure that, and I think, again, we're going to discuss it more on another slide, but the timelines are met and the process itself, but also the data itself. They've also gone back in to QA the data, and they have a different perspective than we would internally. Again, we're seeing who's really good at that, who really knows the cases, who really knows the data. So it's a different way to review and analyze your counsel. And again, the big one is cost savings. Being able to redo your e-discovery relationship especially in the current economy, in a way that makes more financial sense for your organization is huge. It's a huge benefit. And being able to build in exactly what you need and what you want and try to get more set pricing rather than have more hourly billing, at least for us, was very important for budgeting purposes. And the benefits there obviously outweigh any, I don't want to say trauma, but any complexities in the migration itself.
That's funny.
You didn't want to say it, but you said it.
But I said it anyway.
All right.
It can.
Erica, what about from your perspective?
Yeah, I was kind of laughing at the trauma word. It can be difficult, but honestly, you're like Chris, like you were saying, you're doing it for a reason, right? You've looked at the pros and cons, and you know what you're moving toward and why. And just because, if it's easy, it probably wouldn't be worth it, right? It's difficult. Good things come to those that are willing to take on a challenge. So it's just kind of building on Rebecca's point around being able to start fresh on the things and kind of take put new eyes on things. I think this is the time to do it. It's much easier to kind of take stock of everything and address maybe outdated processes and things like that in a transition that's already happening than it is to kind of break out of the status quo when you've been sitting in it for a while and nothing else is changing. So, I mean, there are different things you can take a look at, but like I've seen things like, you know, maybe you have a consolidated repository in the mix of everything, and it's kind of not useful anymore. Like maybe it's just outdated, the data doesn't really apply for what you have now. It's been around for a long time and it's just kind of sitting there. Well, get rid of it, you know. And really just in general, taking a hard look at your inventory in terms of everything you have. Remember we mentioned, you know, working with your vendor to establish very clear and confirmed understanding of exactly what's in play. Like go through that. You need all of it. Maybe some things are crucial and should be kept active and easily accessible. Great. Maybe there's some other things that need to be kept around, but could be moved somewhere that is less expensive, either to your own storage or with your new vendor to like some sort of archival or nearline state. And then there's probably at least a few things, like I said, that just need to go. And this is the time to be looking at all of that. And then outside of that, outside of the data, I think this is a good time to just look at your overall workflow and approach. You know, is it outdated? Is it too rigid? I mean, this is a great time to establish a new, more flexible way of doing things that works better for you and the various teams involved in this. So make this a part of the discussion with your new vendor. Tell them, you want to tell them what is and isn't working for you currently, and then they can advise on, okay, there are these things that you want to keep in place and are important to you, but these other things aren't. You know, here's some options on how to address those things and make sure that we are doing things in a way that are ideal for your goals at this stage. They can be totally different than they were 5 years ago. So yeah, this is just the time to take stock and reevaluate.
Yeah, that's a great point. Like to put it in that perspective, it's not just about moving data over and standing up relativity databases, right? It's about creating a new e-discovery program around it and having your vendor help support that. So great points. So we have just, have a couple more slides left for those in attendance. Would love some questions to pop up. We've got comment agreeing that having a project manager is important. So we're getting some agreement from the audience, which is great. Let's move forward with some crucial data points to track. So let's jump in. Rebecca, crucial data points, from your perspective, what do you feel like are some of the most important things to track as you're working through a migration?
Litigation schedule is so important. You really need to understand what stage your cases are in before you can schedule your timing of migrating over matters. That was crucial to us. We had some cases that were in absolute sleep mode, where we were waiting for summary judgment rulings or other court actions that we knew wouldn't happen anytime during our migration timeframe. We had other matters that were in active discovery or an active summary judgment briefing, where our counsel needed to have their hands in the data at all times. So partnering with your external counsel, understanding those timelines, understanding where, what stage your litigation matter is in, is very, very important, because then you can pick those, low risk or low hanging fruit matters that nothing is going to happen, and move those around your very active matters that need to be moved at a very specific time frame within your overall migration calendar. You also have to understand, the impacts on the data itself, meaning you have to be able to give your external counsel a drop-dead deadline of this is the last time you can go in and touch anything, because then the prior vendor is going to be taking that data set and finalizing it and starting the transfer over. You also have to build in on the back end QA by your external counsel to make sure that the data came over properly, that nothing was corrupted. We had a couple databases that were copied incorrectly and had to be redone. Luckily, it was on cases that were not at that moment very active, so they had time to fix them. We also had matters that were taken out of the time frame that we'd all agreed to, and so we had to get those back on track and closed down in an appropriate way. So this is where that partnership with your external counsel is so key, because if you're not doing this hand in hand with them, you do run a real risk of stepping on some sort of a court deadline or active period within the case that having data in transit will really affect. You also have to account for the data transfer speeds, which was something that we weren't expecting. There are, depending on the platform, some data is taken, and the size of your data. I think we have, Chris, Erica, you may know better. I think we had a couple matters where it literally took a week for the data to transfer electronically. And because of the pandemic, there was nobody in our prior vendor who could go in, put things on a hard drive, which again would still take a while, but may have been a quicker way to transfer the data than it ultimately ended up being electronically. But we are, as we all know, in such an unprecedented time right now, and that is adding in complexities that we would never have envisioned when we started this process in February. So that's also something to plan for. And also, this is where you're looking at your data, what's coming to the new vendor, what's not. And, those old matters, handle them separately. Handle them maybe even with a different team, those ones that are just coming over from your prior vendor to your own internal storage, and keep that separate from all of the work and that needs to be done on the active matters. So again, it's timing, it's understanding, what resources your old vendor has to help you with the transition, and work with them in a way to soothe over any hard feelings, and stay within your litigation timelines that are so important.
Yeah, definitely.
Great point. Erica, do you have anything to add?
Yeah. So I agree with all of that for sure. And then I think one thing that can be helpful is allowing yourself a little time up front to get a sense of what you're working with. And what I mean by that is basically doing what you can to kind of test the waters, identifying dependencies and things that you hadn't planned for, because it can help you get an overall level set and get clearer estimates. And so, one approach to this is basically doing some benchmarking at the beginning, and working with data that is lower risk. So as Rebecca mentioned, things that are like kind of stale or not a lot going on with them, so downtime isn't a concern and stuff like that. You can use these in the beginning as kind of your test cases to understand what kind of timing you might expect, identify any unexpected things that might pop up, and then be prepared for them going forward. And what's nice about this is that you're not losing any time by doing this, right? Because these things have to be addressed anyway, but because they're low risk, you can kind of use them as your guinea pig. The only caution to this, though, of course, is that obviously not all matters and data are created equal. So meaning that it's not necessarily the case that just because two matters are the same volume overall that they can be expected to behave in the exact same way. We definitely saw, we've definitely seen on the migration with Rebecca's company as well as other ones that file count can really play a very big role in how long things can take. So two things with the same volume, but one with like drastically higher file count is likely going to take longer to handle from like a transfer standpoint and stuff like that. So, just get your sense, but also know that, nothing's going to be exactly the same, but you can at least get an idea. The other important piece that doesn't really have anything to do with the data or the matters themselves is understanding what you can expect from your vendors. You definitely want to establish clear expectations around any limitations that may be in place. So, for example, is there a maximum number of matters that can be migrated at the same time? Maybe this is 3, maybe this is 5, maybe it's 1. And these things are important to know, obviously, from a timing and planning standpoint. Are there scheduling constraints? Like there's things like sometimes there's, vendor downtime for maintenance that you need to work around. With COVID, as Rebecca mentioned, not necessarily the case that folks are in the office all the time. That schedule is probably different. So you might, if you do need to have someone in the office for any particular point, you definitely need to understand what the schedule is and plan around that. You can't just assume they'll be ready and waiting at any time. And then, thinking about, is there anything off the table or limited in terms of data transfer? So going back to potential minimal in-office presence, maybe physical shipments need to be avoided if at all possible, or maybe there's different electronic transfer options, but one is not something that one of the vendors will support. So you need to kind of establish, what the expectations are there. And then if at all possible, it's good to get some SLAs in place in terms of what can I expect for, different pieces of the puzzle and for different types of matters in terms of timing. Like, can you essentially confirm that none of my matters based on what are going to take more than a week or something like that? So just really making sure that those expectations are established up front and you're not running into surprises that could be avoided if you had just had the conversation in the beginning.
Great point. So let's segue into the things that we can't prepare for. The unexpected, which I think inevitably there's always something that comes up that is unexpected on these migrations. But how can you prepare for that? So Rebecca, what are some things that, what are some items that you would need to be prepared for that you did not expect out of the gate?
Really what we weren't prepared for were the data differences, our understanding of what the data was and the reality of what the data was. So that goes back to trying to get your information right up front as early as possible as to what, when you're given any statement of what data is currently stored in your repositories, get a definition of what that means. What are they including in that number? Because we were way off base with how much data we thought we had. And that's where maintaining a partnership with your outside counsel and your vendor and your team is really important. And trying to also maintain that relationship with your exiting vendor, because they still need to partner with you through this process. And they need to still participate with their ability, even though they're losing a client. And being able to have the two vendors interact as well with external counsel will make sure that your litigation timeframes are met and there won't be any issues with those court deadlines that you may have. Partnership. I mean, I can't stress that enough. We had our external counsel involved from the front end. We had external counsel, advising us on the whole RFP process. So getting your true e-discovery resources involved, whether you have them internally or not, and utilizing them is so important to trying to make sure that everything goes as smoothly as possible. Because there's going to be hiccups. As I said, we had a couple databases that were corrupted and had to be rerun and retransferred. We've had huge timing issues because of the pandemic. We had breaks where the pandemic first hit, and that delayed the actual migration from really getting going. We've had delays because less data can transfer, or it's taking longer to transfer electronically, and we're limited to the number of matters. As Erica said, it may be only 2 matters can be transferring at once via a certain pathway, and that was all exacerbated by the pandemic itself. And you have to be flexible and adaptable. You have to be able to work with both vendors in order to, again, I keep saying partnership. It's just working together is the only way that this is going to work well. And when you hit those hiccups, which you will hit, you can overcome them with in a much easier manner. So, your external counsel is very, very important in this process.
Yeah, I think, and you also hit on an important point, which is, preparing for the unexpected does, to some extent, start during the RFP process, right? Mm-hmm. Like, there needs to be a lot of transparency during the RFP process so that the vendor knows that they can meet your requirements, right? And that they can really plan for this accurately early on and not have to kind of re-extract all the information. So obviously it's a balance, right, in terms of being transparent and not sharing too much information about your program and your data and everything. From a vendor perspective, the more information, the more accurate information we can get about your data composition, landscape, the types of technologies you're using, all of that will help create a successful migration down the road once selected. So Erica, anything that you want to add in your experience?
Sure. Yeah, and honestly, I'm kind of playing on the same themes here, but just not to, I don't think it can be overemphasized that you really kind of need to mentally prepare yourself to just expect the unexpected. With all the, you can do all the planning, and it's definitely going to help you, but there's just, I've never seen a migration complete without at least some little snag here or there. You know, it doesn't mean it's going to be catastrophic by any means, but, you know, it might throw off your timeline a little bit. There might be a bump here that means you have to go back and redo something like Rebecca was just saying. So just being able to kind of like know that you need to be a little bit flexible and be okay with shifts, and just making sure, again, you've got that partnership so that everybody kind of stays on the same page and understands when things change. You know, you should be able to weather all of that without too much trouble. And then, you know, one really important piece of being prepared that is, and I think I mentioned this earlier briefly, but just do not get rid of anything before you know that you are absolutely certain that whatever migration activities you've had are successful. It really can't be emphasized enough. You have to plan for the worst case scenario at the very least, which is that you have to start, like worst case, you have to start over completely, right? You know, if something goes horribly wrong, but you've already gotten rid of your original, you're in trouble. So, you know, just don't destroy or delete anything until you have explicit confirmation that it's safe to do so. Yeah.
Great. So let's transition to some of the key takeaways, kind of summarize what we all talked about, and then we'll move into some Q&A. So again, for the attendees out there, if you have any burning questions for Erica or Rebecca, please enter them, and they'd be ecstatic to answer them. So in terms of key takeaways, we have, it's all about partnership. Erica and Rebecca talked about this a lot. I think, you know, that's where we've seen the most success on migrations, is where we get partnership with the client, partnership with their outside counsel, and also partnership with the migrating vendor too. We really do pride ourselves in trying to build partnership with everyone involved to try to make this as a seamless process as possible for the client. Involve your key stakeholders early on, including your vendor. So as we talked about, even in the RFP process, provide transparency about what's going to be entailed from a data standpoint, from a technology standpoint. You know, as part of the RFP process, you know, focus on the migration component as well, because that's really critical to get over that first hurdle. Track some of the crucial data points throughout the migration that we touched upon. And then finally, prepare for the unexpected. We'll emphasize that again. So let's move to the questions. We have one question that's come in. What is the biggest challenge that you have come up against in the context of a migration? So I guess, Rebecca, I'll ask you first, having gone through it recently.
Our biggest challenge was not really understanding what data we had with our migrating vendor. And that threw off everything when we started to have the active meetings with the new vendor and the migrating vendor, as well as our internal project team, because we were blown away by how much data we actually had, and had to really work hard with internal counsel and external counsel to figure out what was necessary to keep, what needed to migrate, what we could store in our own cold storage, and also even further, once we've migrated it, what needs to stay in active data, or what can we nearline. So that was definitely, I think, our biggest challenge.
So that decision in terms of active versus nearline versus offline, was that something that you were anticipating, or once you realized where all the data was, that you realized this was another decision point that you had to make in conjunction with all the key stakeholders internally and with outside counsel?
We anticipated offlining some of it. We did not anticipate offlining as much as we did.
Right.
And we had not anticipated nearlining with our new vendor at all. So again, there was so much more data than we expected that we had to delve into each matter, figure out where it was, what was still needed, whether, whether the repositories were something that we might want to search for, a future case, and then figure out where that data should live on the go forward. It was a much more complicated analysis than we were expecting up front.
Than you expected, right. Makes sense. Erica, what about in your experience?
Yeah, I mean, I think the worst thing I've come up against is exactly the worst case scenario that I mentioned earlier, where it was discovered that one of the databases that had been transferred over was corrupted, and so the idea was to go back and redo it, but unfortunately, just due to lack of communication, and I think just planning in general with the original vendor, they had essentially considered it done once it had gone out the door. So there was nothing to easily recover, which was pretty devastating and really frustrating for our clients for sure. Fortunately, in that case, they were able to recover things via backup, via their existing kind of automatic backup. So it was okay, but that was definitely not a pleasant experience for anyone. So I highly recommend trying to avoid it.
I can tell you're still traumatized by that.
I'm like, my voice is shaking, it's ringing back.
Okay, excellent. Well, it looks like we're almost to the top of the hour and the questions have stopped trickling in. So I'll just take this moment to thank you, Erica, and you, Rebecca, for being panelists today, and to all the attendees out there. Again, we're going to send out a copy of the presentation, and then this will be available as a recording on the Lighthouse website very soon. So thank you again for joining, and I hope everyone has a great rest of their day. Take care, everybody.
Thanks, Chris. You too.
Thank you, Chris.